and you just put in that number there, and you can press the button that sort of relates to what you would like to get out of today. So that's going to help us just sort of tailor the webinar so that it kind of meets your needs, really. So these are sort of things that people have told us before, really, just to sort of try and get an idea about addiction and some of the things that might be important in someone developing addiction disorder, how you might support somebody by way of treatment. So I can see that that's a pretty important thing to you as well. And then, yeah, okay, we'll also think about how you might support somebody. So we can sort of pull from examples that I've had in my career, which of course will be anonymous and fictitious. So yeah, okay, great. That's pretty aligned with what we were hoping you might find interesting. So we can do that. So I mentioned that, you know, it's such a broad concept when we think about addiction, and actually some people will tell you, some people who've experienced this problem themselves will tell you they don't like the term addiction. So there are various terms that we use to describe the behavior of interest. So we might use a term that's describing an excessive appetite. So that there's a professor called Jim Orford who wrote a book called Excessive Appetites, which doesn't really use the term addiction a lot. It talks about an appetite for a behavior that's got out of control. So what's central to all the terms that we use, addiction, substance use disorders, excessive appetites, is this sense that the person that's experiencing the difficulty has lost control over the behavior to the point where it's beginning to cause some harm. So that's a pretty consistent theme that we hear from people, that maybe it started off as something that they could exert some control over. Let's take drinking, for example. So quite a common story from the people that I've seen is that, you know, drinking alcohol started off as a social activity, and for some reason, maybe multiple reasons, it became out of control and they wanted to stop but didn't feel able to stop, or it felt like it was controlling them rather than in the other way around. So that concept of having control over something kind of gets lost when we talk about somebody having a problem with a substance or a behavior. And of course, there has to be that element of harm. So you may know people who maybe do drink excessively but don't seem to experience any harms. And there are lots of people in society that maybe we would define as sort of recreational users who do engage in behaviors like gambling or drug or alcohol use, but don't seem to experience that much harm. But obviously we associate these behaviors with causing harm, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail later on. What we've sort of learned from the literature is that this behavior that used to almost be exclusively associated with drug and alcohol use has kind of widened. So we begin to think of other behaviors that can have the same mechanisms of addiction. And these are things like gambling. So, you know, is gambling a new behavior? No, but what we've seen recently is the emergence of specialist treatment services that will support people who have had significant difficulties as a result of gambling. You may be aware of GamCare, for example, which is a charity that's actually partially funded by some of the organizations that offer gambling as a service. And that's a service that can support people who have found that they're spending disproportionate amounts of money on gambling or have begun to experience difficulties as a result of their gambling. And then other behaviors that might, for the most part, seem like everyday behaviors like shopping or exercising, again, can become out of balance and begin to have that feeling of a lack of control. So the idea here is to, I think, to view it on a continuum, really, in that, you know, maybe we all go up and down that continuum of no harm to lots of harm, depending on what's going on in our life. And again, you may have you may have heard from friends that their alcohol use increased because they were having problems in their relationship or difficulties at work. So it could be the case that there is something that has happened in that person's life that has led them to engage in the behavior a bit more. So maybe previously it wasn't something that was harming, but it's become harming because of that sense of control that has come out of it. And as we sort of say there, you know, we do associate addictive behaviors with problems. So it's important to state that, you know, I think certainly from my experience, all of the people that I've seen in treatment services would tell you that they've got difficulties as a result of their addiction, as a result of their drug of choice or behavior of choice. So it does have an impact on the person's psychological, physical well-being, but as we said earlier, relationships as well. So it can influence families, relationships, your employment. So it's a lot wider than just thinking about the harm that might result to the person themselves. And we'll think about that a bit further on. Let's try and think of another poll. So yeah, we're really interested in your thoughts around this, because there's still quite a bit of debate about, and I don't think, we certainly don't have the time to talk about things from a legal standpoint about, you know, classification of substances, for example, but we're really interested in what you think in terms of which behaviors or compounds cause the most harm. We'll just give that some time for people to respond. Yeah. Yeah, somebody's just put in, you know, disorders of eating as well. So yes, I mean, food is obviously something that, again, is on that continuum of no harm to lots of harm. And typically people may say I'm overeating or undereating as a way of managing the way that I feel. Obviously, we need to separate that out from eating disorders. And again, that's a wide spectrum of disorders. But yes, thanks for that. So yeah, using drugs seems to be the sort of most favored response there. Anna and I were just having a conversation about this earlier. And again, you know, it kind of depends on the context of the discussion. I can tell you in terms of harms to society, alcohol is right up there. So obviously that's a legal compound and a lot of drugs are illegal. But if we think about costs to society, and again, that's a general term, but we're thinking of things like pressure on the health service as a result of people using alcohol, pressures on the criminal justice system as a result of incidents that may be related to alcohol, problems with family functioning and employment, alcohol's right up there. Yeah, again, internet usage and gaming, so not many people think that that's that harmful. Again, that's something that's got quite a lot of attention recently, and we've seen one of the first clinics open up in London for adolescents, actually, so for young people who seem to experience lots of difficulties with gaming too much. Okay, so when we've run this webinar before, we've been asked to kind of differentiate between a habit and an addiction. And I think that question kind of comes out of the fact that sometimes it's really quite difficult to separate habits out from addictions. You know, I think the way that we'd kind of talk about habits are they're kind of automatic learned behaviors that don't require that much cognitive effort. They generally tend not to be harmful and therefore are quite easy to change. So these might be simple behavioral repertoires that are in your everyday life that kind of just seem to happen automatically without thinking about it too much. And therefore, if you're aware of it, it might be something that's quite easy to change. And the difference from, say, a habit through to an addiction, which is a dependence, either a psychological or a physical dependence on something, it is really how difficult people find it to make that change. So when we're thinking about people who might be dependent on alcohol or dependent on opiates, so something like heroin, that's really quite hard to change that behavior, and requires sometimes the support of treatment services or family or friends in order to be able to do that. I'm just going to quickly check the chat, see if we have any questions that come up. Great. Thank you. Yeah, so we said we'd spend a bit of time just thinking about what you do if you've got concern about your own behavior, or if maybe you've got concern for someone else's. I think the thing to say, which has improved over the years considerably, is, you know, that there still is a bit of stigma around reaching out for support if you've got a problem with drugs or with alcohol or with some of the behaviors we've talked about. And I can completely understand that. It might be really quite hard for you to go to your GP and say, I've got a problem with this substance and it's out of control and it's beginning to affect my happiness and it's causing me problems in my life and I really need to seek support for it. I absolutely understand how difficult that is for people to take that step, which means sometimes, unfortunately, that people try and cope on their own and sometimes don't do a good job of coping on their own. So the change there with service provision is to try and make it as simple as possible for people to get into some form of help. So what you'll find, and there will be a local service to you. So wherever you're living in the UK, there will be a local service. And it's really as simple as just typing into Google drug and alcohol support. And when you find those services, it's really quite easy to get in touch with them and arrange an appointment. And the appointment really just means that you get an opportunity to talk to somebody about your concerns. There are also options to just simply drop into those services. So it's entirely confidential. And when you're in the services, you'll then talk to somebody about what you feel you've got concerns about and what options there are to seek support. So if you are worried about reaching out for support because you're worried about what's going to happen, then please, it's confidential and the services know what they're doing. And equally, if you are trying to support somebody to go and get some support, you can do that. You can go with them to appointments to support them if they're a bit unsure about what it is they might want to get from treatment. So thankfully, it's a lot easier to get support. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of other organizations that we'll look at right at the end where you can get support. So it's really easy to get support these days, thankfully. Yeah, another poll for you now. So let's just imagine that you're in that position where you're worried about someone and you feel that they may need some help with this problem. So we're just interested in how confident you'd feel about getting support for somebody who's maybe got a difficulty. Yeah, okay. I guess the good news story there is that the not confident at all is the lowest one. And most of you, I guess, are a bit unsure about how you might approach it because it probably hasn't happened for you yet. And quite a few feel very confident. And that's great to hear. So yeah, feeling confident that you're able to support someone, knowing where to go in terms of which services to access. And we'll talk a little bit more about how you can do that. Because it might be the case that you've got the concern, but the person that you're concerned about doesn't feel the same way. They're maybe not as concerned as you are about their behavior. So we'll think about some things that you can do if you're in that position. Yeah, so at the start we mentioned recovery, which is a pretty blanket term, a very general term that we refer to, that I guess implies that somebody's stopped that behavior and hasn't returned to it. But it's a lot wider than that. So we're really interested in what your thoughts are about what recovery might mean for you. So I'll just run through the options there. So a lot of treatment programs do talk about abstinence, which is, you know, complete cessation of the behavior of concern. So if we can sort of just look at the States and their treatment models, which are very different to ours in the UK, because we operate a harm reduction approach in the UK in sort of the NHS and independent sector. So abstinence is kind of, you know, you need to stop this thing altogether. And if you carry on using, then it's going to be difficult for you to access the service. Yeah, great. So the sort of overwhelming top choice is this sense of having control over your life again. You know, maybe continuing to carry on with the behavior, but to the extent that it's no longer causing the harm that it did previously. And I think that's kind of a good way of describing harm reduction, which is our job as sort of treatment providers is to make sure that when somebody comes into treatment, that they remain in treatment, because if they're not in treatment, we can't help them or support them. So that's a big task in itself. But also just to try and help somebody make changes in relation to other areas of their life, which can then influence the behavior of concern. And I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. So I think that's a great way of sort of describing, sorry, we've got another poll, harm reduction. And the other things in life might be things like employment. So maybe you continue to use alcohol sporadically, but you've got a job and you have the stability of accommodation, maybe for the first time in a long time. Maybe you're no longer involved in crime as a result of trying to fund your drug habit. So these are all really positive things that contribute to recovery, but don't really relate to the behavior of concern, your drug or alcohol use. But the idea there is that if you have that, what we call recovery capital, it puts you in a better position to then address your drug or your alcohol use. So let me just illustrate that with an example. If you're street homeless and you're also an opiate drug user, it's going to be pretty hard to make real lasting changes in relation to your drug use unless you have a safe base, unless you have your physical health taken care of, unless you have your basic needs met. So having an element of control over those things really does put you in a position to then look at some of your choices and some of your behaviors. So that's what we talk about when we think about recovery. It's a lot wider than just simply using substances or not using substances. It's all of these other things that are around your life. And one can influence the other, I think. The more control you have over those other elements, then I think the easier it is to make changes in relation to your drug or alcohol use. And conversely, you know, if you don't have control, I think the harder it is to get control over some of those other things. I'll just quickly check the chat. Yeah. So again, this is another question that's come up time and time again, that people have been really interested in. So what's the average time to recover from an addiction? And again, if you have any thoughts about that, we'd love to hear them in the QA section. I mean, that's a really difficult question to answer. So I'm not going to answer it because I'm not really sure of what the answer is. I can tell you that the literature talks about sustained recovery happening over 2 or 3 years, and then past that point, the person has a better chance of lifelong abstinence. But it's such a subjective thing. So the literature will also tell you that there are some people who've naturally recovered from something as difficult as an opiate problem without ever going into services and having support. And then other people may have 10 years of sobriety and then relapse. And they may view addiction as something that they're going to continuously struggle with throughout their life. So it means different things to different people at different times. And if we're really trying to help someone, it's really important for us to understand what it means for them. And then we can begin to build a plan around them that's what we call person-centered. It really understands what that means for them and what change that makes them likely to achieve. But it's the sustainable recovery that we're interested in, supporting people to get to a point where they stand the best chance of sort of lifelong abstinence from the behavior of concern. But equally, as I mentioned, some people are able to exert control and maybe very occasional recreational users of a substance or alcohol. And that's their idea of recovery. So it's really different from person to person. Yeah, so now we're going to think about how you might support somebody who has an addiction issue. So again, if you think about somebody who may not be that motivated or willing to try and get support, and that's a pretty typical thing that we hear from carers and family members, that they can see all the harm that's resulting from that person's use, but they can't quite see it themselves. So sometimes it is left to family members or friends to try and initiate support for that person. Yeah, okay, so that again, that seems pretty resolute there, that, you know, and I'd really agree with that as well. So the best way to try and help somebody is to give them the best opportunity to get into services. And I think you're right. I think just even listening to somebody's concerns is really the first part of supporting them, isn't it? Maybe not doing the other things which nobody said, which is great, but they're really easy things to do. We should acknowledge that as well. You know, these things are perhaps a bit more natural than these things for some people. And I think you can probably look at, you know, your experiences, and sometimes by default, maybe we do end up doing that. We do end up trying to use emotional bargaining with people because we're just so desperate to get support for them. So that, you know, those are things which are really quite easy to fall back into. But yeah, that's great. I think I agree with that. You know, the way to try and support somebody is to be compassionate, which is not to solve the problem for them, but to be alongside them and let them know that you're there to support them to take the first step to making a change. And the thing that people tell us when they first come into services is, I was really scared about coming along. So it's a massive risk for people to come into services, or so they perceive it to be. It takes a lot of courage for somebody to acknowledge that they've got a difficulty. And of course, if you've never experienced treatment before, you'll have a lot of concerns about what's going to happen and who's going to see what information about me, and how long will it last, and how difficult it's going to be. So just having somebody there alongside them that can kind of share that is incredibly important. And we know that support networks are really quite influential in supporting people. So sometimes we bring in social networks into the treatment sessions, and they support the person outside of the time that they're with us, because this is something that's in their life all the time. It's not just something that occurs between 9 and 5, which is when we're at work. So they become an extension of the support. And that becomes really important for people recovering and then having this sort of sustainable recovery that we talked about earlier. Yeah, so building trust is really quite important. So as a treatment provider, that's one of the first things that you have to do, is to let that person know that you're there to support them, and you be honest about expectations. Some people have quite fixed beliefs about what support is or what treatment is, and for some people it's quite a long commitment and takes a while and requires a lot of mental, emotional effort on their behalf. And sometimes it also requires them taking the risk to want to change the behavior. And if you think about what we talked about earlier, if some of the reasons why somebody started using a substance in the first place is to get away from a feeling, so to get away from a negative feeling or an emotion that's not pleasant, you're asking them to take away the thing that they think is helping them cope. And that's a risk. So you have to be honest about that. It's probably going to be a bit difficult, but the buy-in is that we're going to help you with a more adaptive coping strategy rather than alcohol. So one of the sort of most commonly occurring issues might be that somebody has really bad anxiety and they just can't tolerate social situations, for example, and alcohol helps them tolerate social situations and helps them cope. So if you take the alcohol away as a perceived coping strategy, it's a maladaptive coping strategy, but it's still a perceived coping strategy. You'd have to have something to replace it, because the offer of having to cope with the anxiety without the alcohol or anything else, understandably, isn't that pleasurable for somebody. So, honesty, respect, being trustworthy, they're the kind of foundations of which you can start to support somebody. Expecting immediate change is always something that I think family members, as well as the person themselves, sometimes want. They want an immediate change. How long is this going to take? Am I going to be able to get over this quickly? And again, that goes back to the sort of honesty point. It's important to remind people that this is a commitment that might take quite a while. And if you are supporting somebody, then you can expect difficulties. It's a difficult process for some people to go through. And then we've kind of reverted to these things, trust destroyers, which, as we were talking about earlier, these are really simple things to fall back into. So nagging, criticizing, lecturing, exaggerating, even using yourself to sort of show the person the harm that they're causing themselves. And there are a few other things that seem to some people to be helpful, but actually aren't. So, lending money because somebody needs alcohol because they're withdrawing may come from a good place. It's really hard to see someone in distress, especially if they're a family member, and you don't like seeing them in distress. Therefore, you give them the money so that they can go and buy some alcohol or some substances. And that might seem to come from a good place, as in, I don't want you to struggle, therefore I'm giving you this, but obviously it's not helping because it's just perpetuating the problem. So it's important that we kind of try and avoid these things, because ultimately it's going to stop that person from getting the support that they need. Yeah, we had quite a few questions come up from attendees when we've run this another time, and that was really about, well, if I've stopped and I've made the change, how do I prepare myself for challenges? How do I prepare myself for a bad day when I might be likely to relapse? And maybe I'll just sort of talk about relapse prevention here, because when you've made the change, so when you've stopped, that's one part of it. sustaining the change is the other part, and that's kind of the sustainable recovery that we talked about earlier. And I mentioned at the start that maybe a few of you have had the experience of trying to stop smoking, and maybe stopping smoking several times, but then going back to it. And that's why we describe it as a relapsing remitting condition. So it's really quite typical for somebody to have 2, 3, 4, 5 experiences of stopping and then starting again. And it's important to remember each time that happens, it's not a reason to revert back to how things were at their worst. It's just another opportunity to learn. And that's how we conceptualize it with people when they say, I've relapsed. It's an opportunity to examine the things that were going on that led you to start that behavior again. And what we try to support people with is adaptive coping strategies. So for some people, smoking, drinking, overeating, gambling, all the behaviors that we've talked about that can become difficulties for some people, they're maladaptive coping strategies. So we have to find an alternative, an adaptive coping strategy. And I'll illustrate that with a quick example, if that's okay. So I remember, this is a fictitious case. So somebody that I've worked with previously may have said that they know that there's going to be situations when they're at risk. And it's really about anticipating those times and having a plan to cope with it. And that could be an urge or a craving to you. So as one example, it might be that somebody has stopped drinking, but they know when they go to a wedding in a month's time that there'll be alcohol there. And there'll be people who are drinking and probably intoxicated and having a good time, and may put them under pressure to use as well. So they know that that's going to be a time that really challenges their sobriety. But the good news is you can plan for that. So that's something that you can plan and prepare for, and you can put strategies in place to minimize the likelihood of having a relapse. So what we talk about is having a toolkit, an internal toolkit, which is resources that you can call upon when you notice that you're having a bad day, or when you notice that you're in a high risk situation, and it can reduce the opportunity of relapsing or lapsing. So, you know, for that person that I just mentioned, it might be thinking about refusal skills. So we might role play how they might have the conversation with somebody when they're put under pressure to take a drink. So instead of something that they might just want to avoid and take the drink because they don't want to get into a discussion with someone, they might rehearse how they might have that conversation and politely decline the offer of a drink, or say that they're driving, or say something else that stops that conversation without it becoming difficult for them. Other things might be that, you know, go back to the anxiety example again, that you know that you have to go to an appointment in the community, and that is something that's going to elicit quite a strong anxiety response in you. So maybe historically you smoked some cannabis as a way of calming yourself before you went into the social situation. Again, it would be about making use of your adaptive coping strategies so that you don't feel the need to revert back to your previous maladaptive strategies in order to be able to cope with it. So really it's about trying to identify the problems before they emerge so that you can think about how you might respond. But equally, when they do, you have this toolkit within you, so it's not reliant on anyone else, that you can deploy to manage the situation without reverting back to previous maladaptive ways of coping. So that's, I think, how you can begin to think about future challenges. And in that sense, it's kind of this special ability that you have that you can choose to use whenever you like, and that you're in control of it. And this is your toolkit to be able to deal with future challenges. And we talk about this in the app quite a lot. So these are a set of resources that you can learn. that can be very bespoke to you. So they're very personal to you and that you're in control of. And given what we talked about previously, the sense of control goes. So this is really something that will hopefully make you feel more confident about your choices because it's with you. And you're in charge of making that choice. So these are all things which can support you to cope with a bad day, or if you feel that you're at risk of maybe going back to previous types of harmful behaviors, that you can stop it so that it doesn't get back to how it used to be. But again, the important thing here to remind people of, and we certainly do in services, is that just because that happened, it doesn't mean that you're going to revert back to how things were. It's an opportunity to learn. And we might ask them to come back into services and just have some booster sessions and run through their relapse plan, or a fire drill, as we like to call it sometimes, which is, if this happens, do this. If this happens, do this. If this happens, do this. So you have a strategy before it happens, so you're not leaving it to chance. Yeah, what can I do when I feel I need a drink? How can I stop myself? So again, this is a question that came up, and this I think relates to cravings and urges. So you could substitute drink for food or some other compound or some other behavior, and this is something that can arise at any time. So sometimes we hear from people in services that they get a memory that's elicited from something that's quite innocuous, like a song. So they're sat on their own and a song will come on and it will remind them of a time when they were using. And they will have this expectation of use because of the song, or a smell, or a place, or a person. It can be many different things in that person's environment. And they'll have this crave or urge to use as a result of that pretty innocuous thing. And again, that wouldn't mean anything to you or I, because it's such a subjective thing for that person. But you can do something there to stop it from being something that ends up with a period of use. So we use this sort of metaphor of riding the wave, surfing the urge. And the idea there is that it is going to extinguish in the same way that a surfer starts to ride a wave and it gradually decreases and it ends up being calm. It's kind of the same with this type of urge as well. It might feel quite intense at the start for a couple of seconds, and it might be giving us memories of using and the pain that was maybe associated with using, or the euphoria that we associated with using, and it might seem really tempting to use. But the idea there is, if you just ride the wave and that you don't give in to the urge, it will extinguish itself. And some of the things that we've put in the app help with that. So a lot of the mindfulness-based meditation and relaxation that we've put in the app is about attentional control. And the idea with the attentional control is that you shift your focus of attention from the thing that you're worried about onto something that's quite neutral. And that's a skill that you can learn. And the idea with that is that you're shifting your focus onto something neutral that's not going to put you at risk of using, and that then becomes the wave that extinguishes itself. So the intensity of the feeling with the urge right at the start will dissipate, will gradually phase out, and you won't feel as at risk of using compared to when you first had that urge. So for other people, that might be opening the cupboard and seeing a packet of biscuits and having an urge to start eating them. And they may, or a cigarette, you see a packet on your couch and you have the urge to start smoking, and you could give in to that urge and start smoking or eating or using, or you could do something like this and take yourself away and for 5 minutes just focus on your breathing, or do something entirely neutral, and the urge will hopefully dissipate and you won't feel compelled to engage in the behavior again. So again, that's a teachable skill. It's something you can practice, and it doesn't rely on anyone else. It's something that you can have within that internal toolkit that can help you stop from engaging in the behavior again. I'll just check the chat to make sure there's no questions that come in. Yeah, there's a couple of questions there which I'll pick up at the end because they're really interesting. Thank you very much. Sorry, let me go back. Yeah, so that's what we mean by relapse prevention. Having strategies in place to prevent relapse. And the longer somebody goes without relapsing, the longer the recovery period is. And as I mentioned, the sustainable recovery after a couple of years seems to be the point that people generally don't return back to use. So if you can imagine, you know, two axes, the longer somebody sustains recovery, the less likely they are to relapse, which kind of makes sense, doesn't it, really? And conversely, some people do relapse quite quickly after a treatment episode. So the story I heard quite a lot is I went to rehab and I started drinking or I started using a couple of days after I left, which is why aftercare becomes really quite important, because you can take yourself away into a rehab and you can be detoxified from opiates or alcohol, but you're returning into the environment that maybe supported it. So it's not simply the case of detoxifying yourself from the substance that's concerning. It's also about making those changes in relation to your environment, the things that maybe supported your use, which are the things that we talked about when we're mentioning recovery is a lot wider than just simply not using substances anymore. It's about making changes in relation to other areas of your life. Okay, I think we've got probably about 5 minutes left for any questions. If you wanted to pop them in the Q&A, there's a couple in already, which I'll try and answer. Or equally, if you've got some opinions on that as well, it would be great to hear from you. What we're really mindful of doing is just sort of giving you the resource before we finish. And as I mentioned before, the really good news is that there are lots of options. And again, people can pick and choose what they would like. So the person's in control of making the choice around what services they would like to access. So on that top link there, you'll see access to national drug and alcohol services. They shouldn't be far away from you. And you can drop in, as I say, or you can begin the conversation with them pretty simply. You know, you can always go and see your GP as well if you're concerned about something that isn't drug or alcohol, but is beginning to have a bit of an impact on your life. One of the questions we had come in was about sex addiction. Yes, so, you know, sex and love addiction is something that, again, has probably always been a problem for some people, but seems to have got a lot more attention. And there does tend to be a lot of what we call peer support for somebody who's going through that. Not so much as a specialist service in the NHS. I guess it would sort of come under traditional addiction services, or maybe improving access to psychological therapies. The mechanisms are the same, I guess, in a lot of respects, but obviously there are differences in terms of things like intimacy and attachment and choices around partners, and probably a few other issues that would need to be explored in order to work out why somebody continues to over engage in an activity and it causes them some harm. I'll just pick up another question. Yeah, so this is a pretty common question, really. So how can you help somebody who refuses to seek help for an addiction? And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that, because I guess there's a moral question there as well, isn't there? and everybody has the right to make unwise decisions. And we typically make a lot of unwise decisions. So at what point do you go against the person's wishes in some cases and organize support for them? And that's a difficult thing to try and answer, really, because you might be more concerned than the person that you're concerned about. As I said earlier, they might not have any concerns. It might be the case that they think it's absolutely in control and the only person that's worried about it is you. And often what we see is this sort of concept of denial, which I don't think is a great term to use, but really what I think that is about is people aren't ready, willing, or able to seek support. And often then it's a case of it's not important enough for the person to get help, or they're not confident enough to get help. So importance and confidence become really quite important. And sometimes it might be the case that you might mobilize people around you so that it's just not you having that conversation with someone. For some people, they really don't want to access services. They're not ready to make that change. And you could find that sometimes you put a wider gap between you and the person by trying to get them into treatment. And oftentimes we know that things like surprise interventions, which again, you've probably seen a lot of in the States, they don't really do much for the person to make the change. So just quickly, the surprise intervention is kind of where you organize a birthday party or some sort of gathering, and you invite the person that you're concerned about, but it's really an intervention. You're surprising the person with your concerns. So you have the person there and you tell them how harmful their behavior is and how you want to support them, and then you take them off to a rehab facility after that. You know, that might shame somebody into making a change or make them feel guilty about making a change, but it hasn't come from them. And what we know about recovery and standing the best chance of having this sustained recovery is if it comes from the person themselves. And this is what we call intrinsic motivation to change. If I'm being told by somebody else to do something, I may do it, but am I going to sustain it? If I find the reasons myself to make that change, it's a lot more important to me, and I'm much more likely to make the change and sustain it longer term. But I think if you're really concerned, then it's worthwhile doing some of the things that we talked about earlier, listening to their concerns, trying to speak compassionately with them about the behavior and why you're concerned, and sharing with them the impact that it's having on you. So if it comes from a good place of trying to help rather than, you know, the trust destroyers that we talked about, then I think it's more likely that the person will have a conversation. But it might be starting small, and it might be a lot of different conversations, and it might be asking somebody to be curious about what treatment might be like rather than demanding. Because I think the sort of approach of you have to go and do this, you have to go and do that, you know, doesn't work for a lot of people. It kind of puts them off and might make it more difficult to get them in. So I think slowly, compassionately, letting them know that you're alongside them, that's the sort of right approach to take that, I think. Okay. I think we're kind of at the end. So thank you so much for your participation. There is a QR code there for you. And I think Bronwyn has put some of the resources on the chat function. If you're wanting to seek support for yourself or for someone else, then please check those out. Yeah, I mean, look, I think we just want to leave you with those resources, because you're never alone if you're struggling with this. Even if you don't have somebody around you, there are services out there that can help you. We realize and appreciate it's a big step to take, but I think it's going to be worth it if you're struggling with something like this. And recovery is possible, change is possible, and treatment does work. So if you are struggling with something, then please do reach out to somebody and get help. Okay, that's it from us. Thank you so much.